After the overwhelming success of the Resident Evil 2 remake, fans would quickly begin speculating about a potential remake for the final game of the PS1 trilogy, Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. And this speculation would not last very long, as in December of the same year, we would get the announcement of a Resident Evil 3 remake releasing in early 2020. This announcement would be met with equal parts excitement and skepticism though, with many being worried about how short the turnaround was on this one, as it seemingly only got a year of development. This wasn't enough to deter most fans though, as the RE2 remake was received very well, and many were just incredibly excited to see the same treatment being given to RE3. But when it eventually came out, that excitement quickly turned to disappointment for many fans of the original. A lot more was changed with RE3 than with 1 or 2, entire areas were cut, and there was a general feeling of Capcom having rushed this one out in the span of a year to make a quick cash grab off the back of RE2's remake. But now, it's been almost 6 years since that April 2020 release, and we've gone back and played nearly every Resident Evil game on this channel, as well as 100%ed the original RE3 on stream since then. So today, let's take a look back on the Resident Evil 3 remake and see if that colder reception was really justified, or if we were just let down by the exceptionally high expectations set by the RE2 remake. But before getting too far into things, I should mention that this is the 27th in a series of videos where I'm playing and reviewing every game in the Resident Evil franchise in release order. You don't have to have seen the other videos in the series in order to enjoy this one, but I would highly recommend that you've at least seen my videos on the original Resident Evil 3, as well as the Resident Evil 2 remake, as both of those games are going to be referenced a lot throughout the video. So for those of you that are interested in checking those out, or just the rest of the series first, I'll have the full series playlist linked in the description below. But with that out of the way, Resident Evil 3 is a survival horror game developed and published by Capcom for the PlayStation 4, PC, and Xbox One in 2020. The game is a remake of Resident Evil 3 Nemesis for the PS1, and as such, the story is largely the same as it was there, at least in terms of how it affects the overall series lore and continuity. The actual moment-to-moment events of the story and the ways in which characters are written are super different here compared to the original, leading to a story that, while it doesn't really change much outside of RE3 itself, feels totally different from the one that we got back in '99. We still play as Jill Valentine trying to escape the Raccoon City outbreak, and all of the major plot beats from the original, like the encounters with Nemesis and the UBCS, are still here. But everything just feels very unfamiliar in this remake, as opposed to RE2, where things still felt relatively the same in spite of the rewrites that were made. That being said though, different doesn't necessarily mean bad, and at the risk of starting this video off with an opinion that will already put me on the community's hit list, I find RE3 Remake's telling of these events a lot more interesting than the originals. From the moment the RE3 Remake starts up, it's very obvious that they were much more interested in telling a story that fleshed out more of the lore of the Raccoon City incident, rather than just an isolated survival story like the originals. They dive a lot further into the corruption of the RPD and the local government as a whole in this game, including documents in the first few minutes that explain that Chief Irons disbanded STARS when they tried to expose Umbrella's experiments after the Spencer Mansion, and even went as far as personally suspending some of them from the police force and sending men to stalk them at all hours of the day just to make sure that they didn't potentially leak anything, even when they were just inside of their own homes. They've also done a much better job with the characterization here in the remake, and similar to what happened with the RE2 remake, while I already loved a lot of the RE3 cast in the original, I just enjoy them way more here. Jill has been given a lot more depth as a character than she's ever had in the series before, with the particular highlight for me being the exploration of her PTSD that she now struggles with after escaping the Spencer Mansion. When STARS found that mansion and the horrors within it, they were able to piece together most of what was going on, but smaller details like how exactly the virus spreads, and whether or not they had potentially brought that virus back to the rest of civilization were never figured out. So it makes sense that this incident would genuinely haunt her and other members of STARS potentially, and be a near constant source of anxiety once they return to normal life again. She also trusts the UBCS soldiers far less upon meeting them here than she did in the original, which, again, just makes a lot of sense given her experience in the Spencer Mansion. She's very cold to them at first, and really only works with them out of necessity. But as the game goes on, characters like Carlos and Tyrell really grow on her, while characters like Nikolai, well, he's still Nikolai. Other characters like Carlos and Mikhail are still pretty much exactly the same as they were in the original, but both of them are just written better here, and their actors for the remake absolutely blow away the performances of these characters in RE3, just like you'd expect from a modern RE title compared to one of the PS1 entries.
It's alright, you're going ahead. I'm not gonna die on you, leave you in a cold, cruel, Carlosless world.
Okay.
Get off my train, shit-bird!
And it's a nice plus that both Jill and Carlos have gotten major redesigns from the original, with both being much better looks for them in my opinion. Jill feels a bit more like an off-duty cop rather than her Raccoon City Barbie doll look in the OG, and Carlos really hasn't changed much aside from the new long and messy hair look, but that new hair just fits his personality a lot better if you ask me. And while he's a much more minor character in this game, I have to say that the change they made to Brad Vickers' character is also really good. Brad kind of drew the short straw back in the PS1 trilogy, and was consistently portrayed as the STARS member who was actually a big old scaredy cat who ran away from danger. But here in the remake, they introduce Brad much earlier in the story, and have him die in an effort to save Jill's life, rather than just having him suddenly be killed by Nemesis while trying to scramble away. I will say that I personally prefer his death in the original, as using it to introduce Nemesis into the story was an awesome move, but I can see that they wanted to give Brad a more redeemable personality here, and they certainly achieved that. Plus, the scene outside of the RPD later on in the game where we see a zombified Brad show his humanity for just a moment before biting Marvin is genuinely one of the most impactful scenes from the entire franchise.
Sorry.
Now, the biggest thing to talk about with the story of the RE3 remake is that the live selection system from the original is completely absent here. This was that system that would give you a couple of choices as to what you would do at key moments in the story, and while the story would largely play out the same way regardless of what you chose, there were always slight differences along the way based on your decisions. This added a lot of replay value to the original, as even though you'd get pretty much the same result in the end, it's more about the journey than the destination, and seeing all the different ways that things can go down along the way was really fun on subsequent playthroughs. This system just isn't in the remake though, and we're back to just having one scenario that plays out the exact same way every single time, which would be totally fine if this were just any other RE game, but considering it's a remake of the one title where we actually got to make decisions like that, it's hard not to be disappointed by its omission. Getting a little more into the gameplay though, those familiar with the Resident Evil 2 remake will quickly realize that the two games have a lot in common, like nearly all of their core systems and mechanics in common. When the game first came out, we all just assumed that this was the result of them using the RE2 remake as a base to rush out RE3 in a year, but in the years since its release, we've actually learned a lot more about what happened behind the scenes from a number of interviews and insider reports. When Capcom started development of the RE2 remake in late 2015, the team quickly realized that they would love to do RE3 as well to close out the trilogy. And a little bit after the work on RE2 had started, they managed to get approval to make both. So from that point on, the RE2 and RE3 remakes were being developed simultaneously by two different teams who were both cooperating and sharing assets with one another, with the goal of releasing RE2 and RE3 together as one larger package. But as time went on, this approach would prove to spread resources too thin, as both projects ran into numerous development issues and internal delays. So eventually, the majority of manpower and resources were diverted to the RE2 remake in order to get it ready for its 2019 release. and the planned release of the RE3 remake was moved to a year later to give the team more time to polish that one up, as it had started a little later than RE2 to begin with. So the Resident Evil 3 remake feels so much like the Resident Evil 2 remake because they were quite literally being developed in tandem with the express goal of having two products that each felt like two halves of a whole. So generally speaking, pretty much everything that I talked about for the core gameplay of the RE2 remake also applies to RE3. But don't worry, because since the games were developed by two separate teams, there are still plenty of differences for us to talk about here. Starting out with the actual scenario of RE3 though, there's a major difference in how the two games open. In the original, the game simply opens with Jill flying out of her apartment building in an explosion just as the initial outbreak hits, and dodging zombies for about a minute or so before a short time skip to a few hours later. Here in the remake though, we get a much slower opening in Jill's apartment, where we see her suffering from nightmares and PTSD, learn about how she was suspended from the RPD, and then suddenly, a freshly deployed Nemesis bursts through her wall and starts attacking her. And in this initial attack, Jill is obviously at a massive disadvantage as she's been caught off guard. So Nemesis is just destroying her, and she barely manages to get away from him, which I actually really love in terms of introducing this enemy. I feel like while Nemesis was always a massive threat to the player in the original RE3, we never really saw Jill herself struggling to fight him in any of the cutscenes, and at times, it could even feel like she was just running circles around him in them. But here, they introduce him way sooner in the hopes that the player will be just as shocked as Jill, and quickly establish just how threatening he is by having her narrowly escape him. And while I might not personally think it's as effective as introducing him with the death of Brad, it's pretty damn good. And once she's out of the apartment building, she's out on the streets of Raccoon City during the initial moments of the outbreak, just like in the original. Except here, we get to see way more of that chaos than we ever did before. In the RE3 remake, there's no short time skip after Jill's escape from her apartment. You just go out on the streets and start exploring the opening areas of the game during that initial wave of chaos. Everything is on fire, zombies are spilling out into the streets and through the makeshift barricades that have been put up, and you can still hear the distant screams of civilians, the sirens and gunshots of law enforcement doing their best to keep things under control, and the occasional explosion. It's such a small change that's been made to the opening areas of the game, literally just removing one little time skip, but as someone who grew up loving all sorts of zombie media, seeing the sheer insanity of the Raccoon City outbreak finally fully portrayed on screen is an absolute joy. And similar to the remakes of RE1 and 2, the level design has been totally changed from the original here. You'll be visiting the same areas from the original, but the actual layouts are considerably different from what you remember, allowing you to explore the game for the first time all over again, even if you're a diehard fan of the original. Except here, it's not exactly like the other two remakes. Because in those two games, they used the general map layout from the original, but made tweaks to improve and expand the level design, like making a room smaller or larger to balance out the pacing, or moving a room to somewhere a little bit different just for the sake of flow. But here in the RE3 remake, it feels like they just made entirely new levels from scratch. You'll still be out on the streets of downtown Raccoon City, but none of those streets or shops will be ones that you remember from the original. They're just totally new areas within the same city. You'll still go through the same hospital from the original, but it's actually just an entirely different hospital that happens to share the same name. Now, this might sound really bad, but it isn't inherently negative. It just means that you don't really get that same feeling of exploring an environment that feels vaguely familiar and nostalgic, while also totally new at the same time, which was absolutely part of what made the RE1 and 2 remakes feel so special for longtime fans. No, the real negative comes from just how many of the original areas simply aren't here. And we aren't talking about little 5-minute sections that have been removed like the factory from RE2, we're talking about some pretty major locations from RE3 just not being here. For example, the clock tower was always my personal favorite area from RE3, and it's kind of here. I mean, you can see it in the background of one of the boss fights, but you never actually get to go into it and explore it like you did in the original. And the park area from the original is just entirely absent here. No pseudo substitute like with the clock tower, it's just straight up not here. Although, full transparency here, the park was always my least favorite area of the original, so I'm not personally going to complain about its removal too much. And while it hasn't necessarily been removed, the factory area that served as the original game's finale has been replaced with a second underground umbrella lab that's totally separate from the one we saw in RE2. And this has always just felt silly to me. Like, I get that Umbrella is supposed to effectively control Raccoon City behind the scenes, so having multiple facilities within the city makes a lot of sense. But it made way more sense in the original trilogy, where they had the one underground lab and then a rundown factory that was seemingly abandoned on the edge of town that they were secretly using to perform experiments. Them just having two underground labs in the same city that would likely be right next to each other but just not connect to one another is far less believable in my opinion. And I assume that this replacement was probably made so that they could reuse more assets from the RE2 remake given the development circumstances and the somewhat tight deadline on this one. At the very least though, some additions have been made to balance these out. Something I almost never see brought up in conversation about this game is that there's an entirely new sewer section near the beginning of the game that was never present in the original. This one is probably also here so that they could reuse more assets from RE2, but I feel like it's worth pointing out because it is new and people tend to talk a lot about what this remake took away without talking about what it added in return. Plus, this area is genuinely way more fun to play through than RE2 Remake's sewer section, and I actually enjoy it quite a bit. We also get to play as Carlos a lot more here in the remake, as in the original, we only got one section with him that lasted about 20 minutes, but here we get two proper areas with him. We still play through the hospital as him just like in the original, but he's also the one who visits the RPD now instead of Jill, and both of these areas are a good deal longer and more expansive than they were in the original. Carlos also gets his own upgrades to things like his weapons and his inventory size during these sections that will carry over between them, making him feel more like a secondary character that you play as for about a quarter of the game, rather than just a side character with one short playable segment like in the original. And while they aren't specific to certain areas of the game, there are also a couple of new enemy types that are absolutely worth a mention here. The first is the new NE Alpha Zombie that's introduced roughly a couple hours into the game. These are the result of Nemesis going up to a zombie and quite literally implanting them with a small sample of his parasite, causing that parasite to merge with the zombie's skull and form a sort of helmet around their head. This parasite can then use a long tentacle to attack you, as well as some of its smaller limbs to shield the zombie's head from headshots, forcing you to shoot the NE Alpha zombies in the body in order to open them up for a critical shot. Then there's the Paleheads, a rare mutation of the T-virus within a human host that causes them to grow incredibly thick skin, which also regenerates at incredible speeds. These guys will quite literally regenerate from any damage you throw at them during a fight, and the only way to put them down for good is to dish out large amounts of damage in a short time to try to offset that regeneration. This can be really annoying when you're first playing through the game, but if you're looking for a pro tip, hit them with either a flame round or an acid round from Jill's grenade launcher to throw a damage over time effect on them. Then quickly swap to your shotgun and fire off 2 or 3 shots. And that combo will be enough to quickly put them down without using up too much of your ammo like 99% of the time. And the 1% that it isn't, you might just have to use 4 shotgun shots. Both of these enemy types are actually really fun and fit the more action-heavy survival horror theme of Resident Evil 3 really well. They shake up the standard zombie types just enough to make you approach them differently, but without losing that simplicity that we love in a basic zombie, and I'm actually a really big fan of both of them. Speaking of RE3's more action-heavy design, the emergency dodge mechanic from the original has been brought back here. Except this time, it's been renamed to the Quick Step. And this has been made way more intuitive and easy to use than the original emergency dodge, as anytime you want to activate a quick step here in the remake, you can simply press the dedicated button for it and move in a direction to perform a short little dodge. Unlike the originals, where you had to perfectly time pressing the fire button with an enemy's attack to execute it at all. That's not to say that perfect timing isn't rewarded anymore though, as if you do manage to time your dodge just right, Jill will fly past the enemy's attack in a larger dodge roll, and if you press the aim button immediately after this roll, the game will also enter slow motion and you'll snap onto the enemy's weak point for a chance to deal some massive damage as a reward. This is a great way to make the dodge easier to use at a base level, but without taking anything away from the more skillful players. And during those sections where you play as Carlos, he gets a massive straight punch instead of a dodge roll, which is honestly even more satisfying and just reflects the difference in their combat styles really well. And believe me, there's nothing better than getting the timing down for the hunters and just bullying them as Carlos by putting them on their asses every time they come at you. Especially now that they've been given their insta-kill attack from RE1 again. Yeah, I'm not gonna lie, I ate this attack way more than I should have trying to learn the timing while recording this video. But once I got it, it was so worth it. On a less positive note though, the awesome inventory from the last couple titles has been slightly downgraded here in RE3, and I really have no idea why. Not that the design has really changed, but it's just been blown up to take up the whole center of the screen rather than being a smaller tab on the side, which just feels kind of silly compared to what it looked like in RE7 and 2 Remake. And it doesn't seem like the resolution on this inventory has really been increased accordingly, as the blocks look a little bit noticeably fuzzy compared to the last couple titles. Though this is probably more noticeable for someone like me who plays on a larger 4K monitor. This increase in size has also been carried over to the little HUD widget that pops up whenever you swap between your weapons, which, again, just looks silly and noticeably more fuzzy than in the last couple games. And worst of all, they took away that feature where you can place or combine items as you pick them up that 2 Remake had, and we're now back to picking up items and then opening your inventory to sort them like in RE7, which again is such a small difference, but just a step back on something that was already nailed pretty much perfectly in the prior title. So overall, it's not game-changing, but it is worth mentioning that they made some pretty silly adjustments to the inventory. The defense items from RE2 Remake are also just missing this time around, being replaced by simply mashing buttons to break out of an enemy's hold like in the classic era titles. Interestingly though, Jill and Carlos both still have knives that they can use as weapons, and the flash and frag grenades are also still here. It's just that all of these items have had their defensive utility removed and are purely offensive tools this time around. Honestly, I think this was the right call seeing as they've added the quick step and the punch moves into the game now, and having those available as well as a defense item to fall back on if you messed up the timing would probably feel a bit overly safe. So the defensive utility being removed is most likely a positive for the overall balance of the game. Something that was a really pleasant surprise in RE3 was the addition of a bunch of weapon parts to upgrade your arsenal with, just like what we saw in the RE2 Remake. The majority of them are still just locked behind optional puzzles and such the way they were in RE2, but some of them have been relegated to being drops from the optional Nemesis encounters, which I absolutely love due to how similar it is to getting those upgraded weapons from him in the original. Now, we aren't getting entirely new weapons this time around, so it doesn't feel quite as special to earn one of these, but it fills almost the exact same role, and I honestly might prefer this, since you couldn't load the enhanced ammo into the improved weapons in the original, so I almost never actually used them even though I would try to earn them every single playthrough. And since we're already on the topic, now is probably the time that we should finally talk about Nemesis. Nemesis was always the thing that distinguished RE3 from the 2 games that came before it. I mean, hell, he was so integral to the experience that they named the entire game after him. Here in the remake though, he feels like he takes a bit more of a back seat to the main survival horror loop. That's not to say that I think he's utilized poorly here, but he just doesn't appear as often as he does in the original. Now, I've heard a lot of criticism from fans of the original about how Nemesis only shows up in moments where he's scripted to here in the remake. But the thing is, that's how Nemesis always worked. In the original RE3, every single Nemesis appearance, whether mandatory or optional, is hard scripted and guaranteed to occur every single playthrough. But the game does a really good job at hiding this fact and making it feel random, because his appearances are determined by the live selection system. Depending on the decisions you make, Nemesis will appear in slightly different places at slightly different times. But if you were to go and do, say, 3 playthroughs in a row where you make the exact same decisions every single time, you'll notice that Nemesis will appear in all the same places every single time. It feels random and dynamic, but it isn't, which, if nothing else, is a testament to how creative the team at Capcom was back in the day when designing him. Now, it's absolutely fair to criticize the remake by saying that his encounters no longer feel random, because they absolutely don't, and this is obviously the result of them removing the live selection system, but it drives me crazy hearing people constantly criticize the remake for not recreating something that never existed in the first place. Now, something that I will absolutely join the majority in criticizing is the mandatory Nemesis fights in this game, as these are definitely far too scripted, and at times overly gimmicky as well. There are numerous times throughout this game where Nemesis will appear and start chasing Jill, and the player will have to do nothing but hold the forward input and just watch Jill run down a path while doing whatever she has to do to escape him. There are also some QuickTime events that, while they certainly look cool, just aren't anywhere near as tense or exciting as an actual fight with him would be. Then there's the matter that 3 of the mandatory fights with him have a distinct gimmick to them, like shooting Nemesis off the walls with mine rounds, shooting him off the wall by shooting the big red lights, or popping a few big glowy weak points to stun him so you can charge up a railgun, which, in this fight, is the only weapon that's capable of dealing actual damage to him. And my largest criticism of Nemesis in both the optional and the mandatory encounters, which I see as the biggest flaw of them all, is that he's just not as dangerous as he was in the original. Part of what made Nemesis such a memorable enemy back in the PS1 version was that he was so incredibly dangerous that he often felt outright unfair, which, you know, makes sense given that he's essentially a tyrant on steroids who's hell-bent on killing Jill. Here in the remake though, he's pretty tough, but nowhere near as scary as he was in the original. And especially once you figure out some of the weapon combos that can drop him quickly, fighting him starts to lose all of its tension. He's still fun to fight here, even in the more gimmicky fights a lot of the time, but he just never feels as intimidating as he did before. And I honestly feel like that lack of tension in every encounter is the main reason that he feels so different here in the remake. Overall though, I want to end this video by emphasizing that I really do enjoy the Resident Evil 3 remake, and I always have a ton of fun playing through it whenever I come back to it. But I just think that this is the first remake from the series that feels like a genuine step back from its original counterpart. It majorly misses the mark on a lot of what made the original RE3 so special, and it cuts some of the most iconic areas and content from the original as well. But the story is leagues better than the PS1 versions, and the gameplay and level design is still top-notch here just like it was in RE2. It's an incredibly fun Resident Evil game, and feels like it fits right in with the series overall. But if you ask me, it just doesn't really feel like Resident Evil 3. The overall feel of the game, the tone of the story, and the threat of the Nemesis feel totally different between the 2 versions, and while I was originally fairly let down by this on the game's release, I've come to enjoy both versions for what they offer. That being said though, this is definitely my least favorite title of the RE engine era of the franchise, and one that I would still recommend checking out, but that recommendation would come with noticeably less enthusiasm than it does for games like RE7 or the RE2 Remake. So at the end of the day, I'm going to give Resident Evil 3 a 7.9 out of 10. That's going to wrap up this video, but do be sure to check out my other Resident Evil videos if you haven't already, or if you're looking to branch out a bit, maybe check out the series we've been doing where I'm playing every Yakuza game for the first time. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to leave a like, and especially leave a comment to help me out with the algorithm. And while you're down there, make sure to check the pinned comment for a nice little surprise. Thank you for watching, and a very special thank you to our channel members and patrons who make series like this one possible. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more videos like this one, and I'll hope to see all of you right back here for the next Resident Evil review.